The wheelchair hit the doorframe for the third time that morning. Edward Sterling Armstrong gritted his teeth, trying to control the rage that boiled inside him like water about to overflow from a pot. His hands, once accustomed to signing multi-million-pound contracts with imported pens, now struggled against the chrome wheels that refused to obey his commands. The mansion in Greenwich, Connecticut, a symbol of 2 decades of relentless conquests in the New York metropolitan area real estate market, had transformed into a labyrinth of humiliations. Every corridor that was too wide, every step he used to climb without thinking, every bathroom with a cramped shower stall was a cruel reminder of who he used to be. Edward was 42 years old, an empire valued at over £100 million, and now depended on someone else to do what any 5-year-old child could do alone. 15 days. Only 15 days had passed since the accident at the construction site in South London. A poorly secured beam, a moment of distraction while yelling at the foreman for a 2-day delay, and then the impact. The doctors at Mount Sinai Hospital were clear. The thoracic spinal cord injury was severe, but not irreversible. With intensive physical therapy and time, perhaps he would walk again. Perhaps. That word tormented him more than the chair itself. What no one had prepared Edward to face was the collapse of the relationships he deemed solid. Camilla, his fiancée of 3 years, lasted exactly 48 hours after the accident. She entered the ICU with red eyes, but Edward realized it wasn't from crying, but from a sleepless night. Without beating around the bush, she placed the 4-carat diamond ring on the bedside table, so far away that he couldn't reach it even if he tried. "I can't, Ed. I thought I could, but I look at you and I just see this." She vaguely gestured toward the hospital bed. "I'm still young. I deserve to live my life." Edward tried to speak, to beg, to scream, but the medication made his tongue heavy. She left without looking back, the sound of her heels echoing down the corridor like a final sentence. A nurse entered minutes later, saw the ring fallen on the floor, picked it up, and placed it in the pocket of his pajamas without saying anything. The pity in that woman's eyes hurt more than any words. His younger brother, Roderick, sent endless audio messages in the first few days. "Bro, take it easy. I'll come see you. I just need to sort out some stuff here at the office. You know how it is." Then came the excuses. An urgent trip to Washington, D.C., a meeting with investors that couldn't be rescheduled, a problem with his son that needed attention. By the 3rd week, the messages simply stopped. Edward found out from an employee that Roderick was posting photos at a resort in the Hamptons. His mother, Mrs. Gloria, appeared once. She cried, copiously, held his hand, and promised she would return the next day with homemade chicken soup. She didn't return. When Edward called, she answered with a choked voice and said that seeing her son in that state was destroying her blood pressure. The doctor had recommended she avoid stressful situations. "You understand, my son, don't you? It's for my health." The partners of Armstrong and Vance Construction sent a basket of imported fruits so large it wouldn't fit on the side table. Along with it, a generic card. "Get well soon. Count on us." Edward knew that game. They were waiting, calculating how long it would take until they could assume full control of the company. After all, who would entrust large projects to a man in a wheelchair? The friends from parties, from dinners at Michelin-starred restaurants, from Formula One VIP boxes, disappeared like mist under the sun. Calls were no longer answered. WhatsApp groups fell silent. Edward realized, too late, that those people were never friends. They were just spectators of his wealth, interested in the shine he radiated, not the man behind the bank account. Now, alone in the ground floor guest bedroom, because climbing to his master suite on the 2nd floor was impossible, Edward faced a brutal reality. Money didn't buy loyalty. His fortune could pay for the best doctors, the most modern equipment, the most luxurious mansion, but it couldn't make anyone want to stay by his side. He tried to hire nurses. The first lasted 2 days before resigning after Edward threw a plate of food at the wall because the meat was undercooked. The second endured 3 days until Edward accused him of theft for having touched an expensive watch stored in a drawer. The third and fourth didn't last a week combined. The caregiver agency called personally to inform him that they no longer had professionals willing to work with him, regardless of the amount offered. "You need to understand that our professionals have a right to a dignified work environment," the manager said, with a coldness that Edward recognized as the same he used when firing employees for minor mistakes. "You are known for being challenging. No one else wants to take this job. Challenging." What an elegant word to mask the truth. He was unbearable. That night, Edward woke up thirsty. The bottle of water was on the bedside table, but he had turned in his sleep and now it was too far away. He tried to drag himself, supporting his weight on his arms, but his body didn't respond as it should. The effort made him sweat. With a last desperate push, his fingers touched the bottle, but instead of holding it, he knocked it over. The glass shattered on the wooden floor, scattering water and shards everywhere. Edward remained still, looking at the mess. For the first time in 15 days, he felt like crying, not from physical pain, but from the absolute realization of his helplessness. He, who had once commanded teams of hundreds of people, who decided the fate of entire families with a simple yes or no in board meetings, couldn't get a glass of water on his own. It was then that he heard soft footsteps in the corridor. The door opened slowly, and a small figure entered carrying a broom and a dustpan. Mary Grace was 53 years old, with gray hair tied in a simple bun, and had worked as a cleaner in that mansion for 6 years. Edward barely remembered having spoken to her beyond giving dry orders. "Clean. Here. Don't forget there. You made a mistake on this." Mary said nothing. She simply began to carefully collect the glass shards, sweeping the water with precise, silent movements. Edward watched her, still lying in bed, unable to help. When she finished, she left and returned minutes later with a glass of fresh water and a plate of warm cheese bread. "I thought you might be hungry too," she said in a low, almost timid voice, placing the improvised tray on the side table. Edward opened his mouth to dismiss her harshly, to send that woman away and leave him, alone with his misery. But the words didn't come out, because he knew deep down that if she left, he would truly be alone, and that loneliness was more frightening than any physical fragility. "Thank you," he murmured, surprised by his own voice. Mary simply nodded and left, closing the door behind her. Edward looked at the cheese bread, still steaming. When was the last time someone had prepared something for him with care, without being paid for it? He couldn't remember. He picked up the bread and took the first bite. It was delicious, homemade, made with a traditional recipe. Edward ate slowly, each piece seeming to carry a weight beyond simple physical need. It was the taste of unexpected kindness, the taste of the only person who, inexplicably, had decided to stay. Mary Grace arrived at 6 in the morning, as she always had for the past 6 years. The difference was that now she didn't leave at 3 in the afternoon. She stayed. She prepared breakfast, helped Edward with his bath, a humiliating ordeal for both, administered his medication, prepared lunch, organized the home physical therapy he refused to do, and only went to the small maid's room at the back of the house when Edward finally fell asleep. She never asked for a raise, never demanded anything. She simply assumed the role no one else wanted to play. Edward, however, didn't make it easy. If before he barely noticed her presence, now she had become the target of all his frustration and anger. Every small discomfort became a reason for complaint. The bathwater was too hot. No, now it was too cold. The food had too much salt. The rice was mushy. The shirt she chose didn't match the trousers. Why did she take so long to answer when he called? "Don't you have anything better to do than stare at me?" Edward snapped one morning when he noticed Mary standing at the bedroom door, watching him struggle to put on a sock. "I just wanted to know if you needed help," she replied calmly. "If I needed it, I'd ask." He threw the sock on the floor, irritated. "Or do you think I'm incapable of even doing that on my own?" Mary lowered her eyes, picked the sock up from the floor, and left silently. Edward looked at the closed door, feeling a pang of something dangerously close to remorse. But he pushed the feeling away. It was easier to feel angry, The days dragged on in a tense routine. Edward tested the limits of Mary's patience as if it were a scientific experiment. He wanted to prove to himself that sooner or later she too would give up. Because if she gave up, then Edward would be right. No one really cared. No one would endure staying by his side when he had nothing left to offer but difficulties. One Thursday afternoon after Mary served lunch, grilled chicken fillet with vegetables and brown rice, Edward pushed the plate away forcefully. "This is horrible. It tastes like hospital food. Don't you know how to cook anything else?" Mary looked at the plate, then at him. For the first time, Edward saw something different on her face. It wasn't anger, but a deep sadness that made him feel small. "The doctor sent a list of foods you should eat to help with your recovery," she said calmly. "I'm following the instructions, but if you prefer not to eat, that's fine. I'll put it in the fridge." She picked up the plate and left. Edward was left alone in the room, his stomach rumbling and his pride wounded. He knew he was being unfair. The food was good, healthy, but admitting that was admitting she was right, that she cared enough to follow the medical recommendations he himself ignored. 2 hours later, ashamed, he rang the bell Mary had installed so he could call her when needed. She appeared quickly, still wearing her kitchen apron. Is there still some of that food?" he asked, avoiding looking directly at her. Mary simply nodded and returned with the reheated plate. Edward ate, in silence, and for the first time in days, he didn't complain about anything. The real turning point began one Friday dawn. Edward woke up screaming, sweating, his heart racing. The nightmare was always the same. He was at the construction site, saw the beam coming loose in slow motion, tried to run but his legs wouldn't respond. And then the impact, the pain, the darkness. He always woke up at the point of pain, reliving that terrible moment. Mary appeared at the door in less than a minute, in a simple nightgown and with her hair loose for the first time Edward had seen it. She seemed smaller, more fragile without the bun and uniform, but there was a firmness in her gaze that he didn't know. "Was it a nightmare again?" she asked, entering and turning on the bedside lamp. Edward couldn't answer. He was trembling, not from cold, but from fear. Fear of never walking again. Fear of being alone forever. Fear that this was his life now. Forever. Mary sat on the edge of the bed, something she had never done before. It was a breach of protocol, an invasion of his space. But Edward didn't protest. She picked up the glass of water from the side table and offered it to him. Edward drank, trying to control his breathing. "You can't go on like this," Mary said, and there was a new firmness in her voice. "You yell at me, mistreat me, throw things, complain about everything, and I put up with it because I know you're suffering. But I need you to understand one thing." She paused, looking directly into his eyes. "I'm not obligated to stay. No one is. One day, if you continue like this, I will also leave. And then you will truly be alone. Is that what you want?" The silence that followed was dense, heavy. Edward felt the impact of those words like a punch to the stomach. He had never thought about it. He assumed in some arrogant and unconscious way that Mary would stay because she was paid to. But she was right. Money didn't oblige her to endure daily humiliations. She had a choice, and one day she might choose to leave. The idea of being completely alone, with no one to help him with the most basic tasks, terrified Edward in a way the accident never could. "I don't want to be alone," he admitted, and his voice came out small, almost childish. Mary sighed, and the hardness on her face softened a little. "Then you need to stop pushing people away. You need to let someone get close. You need to understand that accepting help isn't weakness." She stood up, adjusted the blanket over him with an almost maternal gesture. "Try to sleep. Tomorrow is a new day." Edward stayed awake for hours after she left, thinking. For the first time since the accident, he wasn't thinking about what he had lost, but about what he could still gain if he just allowed it. The next morning, when Mary brought breakfast, Whole wheat bread with cream cheese, chopped fruit, and natural orange juice. Edward didn't complain. He ate everything, slowly, and when she returned to collect the tray, he said softly, "It was good. Thank you." Mary seemed surprised, but just smiled slightly and left. It was a small start, but it was a start. In the following days, Edward tried. He really tried. He took his medication without protesting. He agreed to do the basic physical therapy exercises the doctor had recommended, even though every movement was torture. He stopped complaining about the food. He thanked Mary when she did something for him. It wasn't easy. There were moments when frustration returned with full force, and he wanted to scream, break things, give up everything. But then he remembered Mary's words that dawn, and he controlled himself. One afternoon, while Mary was ironing in the laundry room next to his bedroom, Edward gathered the courage to ask a question that had intrigued him since she decided to stay. "Why are you doing this? Why didn't you leave like everyone else?" Mary paused the iron, thoughtful. She remained silent for so long that Edward thought she wouldn't answer. But then she began to speak, her voice soft and full of memories. "I took care of my mother for 12 years. She had a stroke when I was 28 and became bedridden. At that time, I was married, had 2 small children, and worked as a cleaner in 3 different houses. My husband couldn't handle the pressure and left. My siblings showed up occasionally, but I was the one there every day, bathing her, changing diapers, feeding her, cleaning." She resumed ironing the shirt, but Edward noticed she was far away, lost in memories. "There were days I thought about giving up, days I cried from exhaustion and loneliness. But I looked at my mother, and I saw that she had no choice. She didn't choose to be sick, but I had a choice. I could choose to stay and care, or choose to leave and let her suffer alone." Mary looked at Edward, and there were tears in her eyes. "My mother passed away 16 years ago, and you know what I don't feel? Regret. Because I know I did the right thing. I know she didn't die alone, without love, without dignity, and that gives me peace." She placed the ironed shirt on the hanger and picked up another. "You treated me as invisible for 6 years. You never greeted me, never asked how I was, never even looked at me properly. But when I saw you alone in that bed, breaking that glass, I saw my mother again. I saw someone who was suffering and who had no one. And I thought, I can choose to turn my back like the others did, or I can choose to stay." Edward felt a lump in his throat. He had never thought of Mary as a person with a history, with pains, with choices. She was just the cleaner. But there was a woman who had sacrificed years of her own life to care for someone, who had learned that true strength lies in serving, not in dominating. "I'm sorry," Edward said, and this time there were real tears in his eyes. "For never having seen you, for never having respected you." Mary smiled, and it was a genuine, warm smile. "But now you are seeing, and that's something." The letter arrived on a rainy Monday in March. Edward was on the back porch, looking at the garden he hadn't visited for months, when Mary brought the envelope with the Armstrong and Vance Developments logo. He immediately recognized the golden font, the imported cream paper he himself had chosen years ago to convey sophistication and power. Inside, 5 pages of legal language that boiled down to a clear message. His partners wanted to remove him from the executive board. They claimed his physical condition prevented him from performing the necessary functions to lead a company of the construction firm's size. They proposed that he become merely a passive shareholder, entitled to dividends but without decision-making power. The document was signed by Marcus Vance, his partner for 15 years, and 2 other directors Edward had personally promoted. Edward read and reread the document, feeling his blood boil. They were trying to sideline him, using his wheelchair as an excuse to take full control of the company he had built from scratch. Armstrong and Vance was his before it was anyone else's. He had started with a single development in Newark 20 years ago, grown project by project, won over every client, built that empire brick by brick. "They can't do that," Edward said aloud, crumpling the paper forcefully. I'm still the majority shareholder. They can't just remove me. Mary, who was watering the nearby plants, looked at him. So what are you going to do? Edward paused. What was he going to do? Sit there feeling sorry for himself? Let them take everything he had built? He looked at Mary, at that woman who was half his size but 3 times his courage, and something ignited within him. I'm going to fight, he said, and for the first time in weeks, there was real determination in his voice. The next few days were intense preparation. Edward called his personal lawyer, Julian Stone, who was surprised and relieved to hear the former client's voice. They reviewed contracts, articles of association, shareholder agreements. Edward was right. He held 52% of the shares. Legally, no one could remove him without his consent. But Edward, they can make your life impossible, Julian warned. They can make operational decisions that exclude you. They can hold meetings without properly notifying you. They can gradually undermine your authority. Then I need to show that I'm still in charge. Edward concluded. I need to show up there in person. The idea terrified him. To return to the company, that glass and steel temple in Canary Wharf, London, where he used to be revered, now in a wheelchair, to see pity or worse, contempt in the eyes of the employees. But the alternative was to accept defeat, and Edward Sterling Armstrong never accepted defeats. Mary helped him get ready on Thursday morning. She ironed his best navy blue suit, the same one he wore for meetings with international investors. She chose a red tie, power, authority. She polished his Italian shoes, even though he couldn't wear them properly. She cut his hair, which had grown too long, and carefully shaved his beard. When Edward looked at himself in the mirror, for the first time since the accident, he saw a bit of the man he used to be. Not physically. The wheelchair was still there, cruel and undeniable. But there was something different in his eyes. A determination that didn't come from arrogance, but from the need to prove that he still mattered. Are you ready? Mary asked, adjusting his tie. No, Edward admitted, but I'm going. Anyway. The driver Edward hired for the day showed surprise at seeing him, but was professional enough to hide it. The adapted van they managed to rent at the last minute wasn't the Mercedes Edward usually used, but it served the purpose. Throughout the journey to Canary Wharf, Edward mentally rehearsed what he would say, how he would react, how he would behave. The Armstrong and Vance building occupied 10 floors of a premium commercial skyscraper. Edward had chosen that location because of the view, the prestige, the location. Now, looking from the sidewalk, he realized he had never paid attention to the accessibility ramp, because he never needed to. The receptionist, Carla, almost dropped the phone when she saw him enter. She had worked there for 4 years, and Edward knew he scared her. He used to yell at her for minor mistakes, for transferring calls to the wrong person, for forgetting to notify him about a delivery. "Good morning, Carla," he said, and the tone was softer than any word he had ever directed at her before. "Mr. Armstrong, we didn't know you were coming today. There's nothing scheduled on your calendar." "I know, it's a surprise." He gave a half smile. "Where are the directors?" "In the 8th floor conference room. They've been in conference with the project managers since 9. "Perfect. Even better." Edward thanked her and headed for the elevator. The trip to the 8th floor seemed to last an eternity. He remembered when he used to climb those same stairs 2 steps at a time, impatient, always in a hurry. Now each floor that passed was a reminder of what he had lost, but it was also a reminder of what he still had. When the elevator doors opened, Edward went straight to the corridor, leading to the main conference room. Through the glass walls, he could see Marcus Vance standing, pointing to charts on a giant screen. Around the table, 12 managers were paying attention. No one noticed Edward approaching. He opened the door without knocking. The sound was loud enough to interrupt Marcus mid-sentence. All heads turned simultaneously. The silence was absolute, heavy, awkward. "Good morning, everyone," Edward said clearly, entering the room. "I hope I'm not interrupting anything important." Marcus visibly paled. He was 10 years younger than Edward, handsome in a calculated way, always impeccably dressed. They had met during an MBA and built the company together, but Edward had always known that Marcus had ambitions beyond their partnership. Edward, what a surprise. Marcus tried to smile, but it was a failure. We weren't expecting you today. Clearly. Edward surveyed the room with his eyes, recognizing each face. Some averted their gaze, embarrassed. Others stared at him with curiosity. I received some interesting correspondence this week. A proposal to turn me into a passive shareholder. The awkwardness in the room intensified. Marcus cleared his throat. Edward, perhaps we should discuss this in private. Why? These are the managers who will execute the projects that I still command as CEO. I think they deserve to know if there are changes in the company's leadership. Edward positioned himself at the head of the table, in the place that had always been his. Does anyone want to update me on the progress of the developments? The tension was palpable. Finally, Renata, the development manager, opened a folder and began to speak about the 3 ongoing projects. Edward listened attentively, asking pointed questions, highlighting inconsistencies, suggesting adjustments. It was as if he had never left. His mind remained sharp, his knowledge remained relevant. Malama, wheelchair didn't change that. After 40 minutes of productive meeting, Edward turned to Marcus. Regarding that proposal you and the other directors sent me, my answer is no. I remain as CEO. I remain in charge, and any attempt to remove me will be met with legal action that will freeze the company's operations for months. He paused deliberately. I'm sure our investors won't like that. Marcus opened his mouth to protest, but Edward cut him off. You have 72 hours to send a formal retraction of that proposal. Otherwise, my lawyer will file a representation with the board of directors. Am I clear? Marcus nodded, defeated for now. Edward knew that wasn't the end, just a battle won in a long war. But it was a victory he needed. He left the room under astonished gazes and found Mary waiting on the ground floor, sitting on one of the reception sofas. She stood up immediately when she saw him coming out of the elevator. So, how did it go? Edward smiled, a genuine smile that lit up his face in a way Mary had never seen. I still exist, Mary. They tried to erase me, but I'm still here. On the way back home, Edward remained silent, processing. The adrenaline of the confrontation was fading, and in its place came something deeper, an uncomfortable realization he had been avoiding, but which now refused to be ignored. He had behaved with Marcus in the same way he had always behaved, with threats, with a show of force, with intimidation. And it worked, as it always had. But as he sat in that boardroom, he couldn't help but notice the fear in the eyes of the managers. The same fear he used to see in everyone around him. He had won the meeting. But at what cost? How many people had he destroyed over the years with that same arrogance? And more importantly, did he want to continue being that man? Mary, he said when they arrived home and she helped him back into the living room chair. You said you took care of your mother for 12 years. Do you regret anything? Mary thought before answering. I regret not having been more patient at times, for having lost my patience when she repeated the same question 10 times, for having sighed impatiently when she took too long to eat. They were small things, but they hurt her. I saw it in her eyes. Edward nodded slowly. I spent my whole life hurting people, and I thought I was right. I thought it was strength. But you can change, Mary said softly. It's not too late to be different. That night, Edward couldn't sleep. He kept thinking about all the people he had harmed over the years, employees fired for minor mistakes, suppliers he had squeezed dry, competitors he had needlessly destroyed just for pleasure, and all the small daily cruelties. The security guard he never greeted, the cleaner he never saw, the delivery person he treated as an annoyance. Around 3 a.m, Edward did something he never imagined doing. He picked up a notebook Mary had left beside the bed for notes and began to write a list of names. Every person he could remember having harmed, humiliated, or treated with unnecessary cruelty. When the sun rose, the list had 47 names, and Edward decided he would call every one of them. The first name on the list was Robert Fletcher, a former construction manager Edward had fired 3 years ago for a 1-week delay on a project. Robert had 2 small children at the time, and Edward remembered sending him away in front of the whole team, yelling that he was incompetent and would never work in construction again. Edward looked at the phone number his legal assistant had found and felt his stomach churn. Making that call meant admitting he was wrong, that he had been cruel, that he had abused his power. It meant showing vulnerability, but he had promised himself he would change, and real change hurt. He dialed. It rang 4 times before someone answered. "Hello? Robert, this is Edward Armstrong." Silence on the other end. Then, the voice hardened. "What do you want?" Edward took a deep breath. "I want to apologize for the way I treated you, for the way I fired you. You didn't deserve that. You were a good professional, and I humiliated you because I was having a bad day and took it out on you. It was wrong. It was cruel, and I'm truly sorry." The silence that followed lasted so long that Edward thought Robert had hung up. But then he heard a deep sigh. You know what was worse? It wasn't losing the job. It was the way. In front of everyone. My colleagues I had worked with for 5 years. I've never felt so much shame in my life. My wife had to see me crying that night, feeling like a failure. Every word was a stab at Edward. I can't undo what I did, but I can tell you that you were right about that project. The delay wasn't your fault. It was the window supplier who delivered defective products. I knew that, but I needed to blame someone. And I chose you because it was easier than admitting my own mistake of choosing a cheaper supplier. Robert remained quiet, processing. I got another job after 3 months. I work for a smaller company now, earn less, but my boss treats me like a human being, so I survived. But thanks for calling. I guess I needed to hear that. They talked for another 15 minutes. Edward discovered that Robert had become a team leader at the new company, that his children were growing up well, that life had moved on despite everything. When they hung up, Edward felt something strange, a lighter weight on his shoulders, but he still had 46 names. The second call was to Patricia Smith, a former receptionist he had fired because she got pregnant, and he didn't want to deal with a pregnant employee taking leave. The third was to Leo, a cement supplier Edward had unfairly sued to avoid paying a legitimate debt. The fourth was to Danielle, an architect who presented a brilliant project that Edward stole and registered in his own name. Each call was an exercise in humility. Some answered with anger, others with indifference. Some cried, others hung up on him. But Edward continued, name after name, apologizing, admitting mistakes, trying to fix what could be fixed. Mary observed from afar, seeing that man deconstruct and reconstruct himself at the same time. She saw him taking notes in the notebook, taking long breaks between calls to compose himself, wiping away tears he no longer hid. "Why are you doing this?" she asked during one of the breaks, bringing him coffee. "Because I need to. Because if I really want to change, I can't just change myself. I need to try to mend what I broke in others." On the 18th call, Edward spoke to Amanda, an intern he had emotionally abused for 6 months, criticizing every piece of work she did, calling her stupid in front of clients until she resigned in tears. Amanda answered suspiciously, but listened. In the end, she said something that stuck with Edward. "I went to therapy because of those 6 months. I developed panic disorder. I was afraid to speak in meetings, to present work. It took me 2 years to get another internship and trust my abilities again. So no, Mr. Armstrong. An apology doesn't erase what you did. But I accept it because I choose not to carry that weight anymore. I choose to move forward." Edward asked to speak to her therapist, offered to pay for past and future sessions. Amanda refused. "I don't want anything from you. I just want you to stop doing this to other people." That night, while Mary prepared dinner, Edward was emotionally exhausted. He had made 23 calls. 24 were still left. But something was different. With each apology, with each story of pain he caused, Edward felt a little of his own pain diminish, as if by acknowledging the suffering he caused, he could finally process his own. "You know what I realized today?" he said to Mary as they dined together for the first time. She had started eating at the table with him, no longer alone in the kitchen. "I spent my whole life trying to prove I was better than everyone else, stronger, richer, more powerful, and deep down I was trying to prove it to myself, because I never believed I was enough just by being me." Mary chewed thoughtfully. "My grandmother used to say that we mistreat others when we are unhappy with ourselves, that a happy person doesn't need to make another person unhappy to feel good." "Your grandmother was wise." Edward smiled sadly. "I was profoundly unhappy and didn't even realize it, because I confused success with happiness. I thought that if I had more money, more power, more things, I would finally feel complete. But the more I had, the emptier I became. So I filled that emptiness by making other people feel small." They fell silent, only the sound of cutlery filling the space. "You are making peace with your past," Mary said after a while. "That's courageous." "It's not courage. It's necessity. I can't live with this weight, not anymore." In the following days, Edward continued his mission. He called all 47 names. Some forgave, others didn't. Some thanked the call, others hung up in anger. Edward accepted everything, because he understood that forgiveness was a choice of those he hurt, not his right. In parallel, Edward began to dedicate himself to physical therapy with an intensity that surprised even the physical therapist himself. Before, he did the exercises reluctantly, complaining about every movement. Now he insisted on doing more than recommended. He wanted to prove to himself, to Mary, to the world, that he could get better. Progress was slow and painful. In the first few weeks, he could barely feel his legs. Then, tingling began. The physical therapist explained that nerves were reconnecting, that there was real hope for recovery. Edward clung to that hope with everything he had. 3 months after the accident, Edward managed to stand supported by parallel bars for 15 seconds. He cried when he succeeded. Mary did too. It was a small victory that meant the whole world. "I'm going to walk again," Edward said with determination. "I will. I know you will," Mary replied, and there was pride in her voice. It was around this time that Edward began to realize that what he felt for Mary went beyond gratitude. He observed the way she cared for the plants in the garden, talking to them as if they were friends, the way she hummed old folk songs while cooking, the way she smiled when he reached a new milestone in his recovery, as if the victory were hers too. Mary was beautiful in a way Edward had never paid attention to before. Not the manufactured and maintained beauty he used to value, personal trainers, dermatologists, aesthetic procedures, but a real, lived beauty that came from within. The beauty of a woman who knew pain and chose kindness anyway. He said nothing, because Edward knew that Mary was there out of compassion, not romantic interest. She cared for him because she was a good person, not because she loved him. And Edward respected that. For the first time in his life, he valued someone's presence without wanting to possess her, without needing her to belong to him. But what he didn't know was that Mary had also been observing the changes in him. She saw the arrogant and cruel man transforming into someone humble and conscious. She saw him fighting every day, not only for physical recovery, but for moral recovery. And at some point, without realizing exactly when, she began to feel something she didn't expect to feel. At 53, after so many years alone since her husband abandoned her, Mary Grace was slowly and silently falling in love with Edward Sterling Armstrong. News of Edward's recovery spread like wildfire. First among the company employees who saw him at the meeting, then among the doctors who followed his case and were impressed with his progress. Finally, on social media, where someone posted a photo of him walking with a walker in the physical therapy clinic's parking lot. In less than a week, the mansion in Greenwich, Connecticut, began receiving visitors. The first to appear was Camilla, The ex-fiancée. She rang the doorbell on a Tuesday afternoon, wearing a white dress Edward recognized as his favorite, or rather, the favorite of the man he used to be. She carried a box of gourmet truffles and a rehearsed smile. Mary answered the door, and Camilla's air of superiority was instant upon seeing who greeted her. "I need to speak with Edward," she said without greeting, trying to enter. "Mr. Armstrong is in physical therapy session," Mary replied politely but firmly. "He cannot be interrupted. I was his fiancée. I think I have the right to enter the house. You returned the ring, if I'm not mistaken." Mary didn't move from the door. "That ended any rights you had." Camilla flushed with anger, but before she could respond, Edward appeared in the corridor, sweaty from exercise, supported by the walker. He had been training for 40 minutes and was exhausted, but the anger he felt upon seeing Camilla there gave him extra energy. "What do you want?" he asked bluntly. Camilla completely changed her expression, softening her voice. "Ed, darling, I came to see you. I'm so happy you're recovering. I always knew you were too strong to let this defeat you." "You always knew?" Edward let out a bitter laugh. "You abandoned me in the hospital. You looked at me lying in that bed and said I was this. You threw the ring and left without looking back. I was in shock, darling. I didn't know how to deal with the situation, but I thought about you every day. I just needed some time to process." 6 months? You needed 6 months to process? How convenient that you processed exactly when news of my recovery began to circulate." Camilla tried to approach, but Mary subtly positioned herself between them, like a silent guardian. "I made a mistake," Camilla admitted, and there were tears in her eyes that seemed genuine until you looked closer and saw they were calculated. "But our love was real, Ed. We had plans. Marriage, children, a life together. Are you going to throw all that away because of a moment of my weakness?" "You threw it away," Edward corrected. "Not me. And you know what I learned these past months? I learned that true love doesn't abandon. True love stays, even when it's difficult, even when there's no glamour, even when the person is at their worst." He looked at Mary, who was facing away from him, but he knew was listening to every word. True love is being there when the person has nothing to offer but pain and difficulty. And you weren't, Camilla, but someone was. Camilla followed his gaze and understood. Her expression changed from false sweetness to contempt. "The maid? You're replacing me with the cleaner?" "Edward, be serious. She's with you because you pay her salary. Do you really think she'd be here if you were poor?" Mary turned slowly, and there was a wounded dignity in her eyes that made even Camilla take a step back. "I stayed when he couldn't pay me anymore," Mary said calmly. "I stayed when he mistreated me. I stayed when everyone else left, including you. So don't question my motives when yours are clear to anyone with eyes." "You need to leave," Edward said to Camilla, "and don't come back." "You'll regret this," Camilla practically spat. The words, "When she leaves you too, you'll see I was right. If she leaves me, it will be because I deserve it. But unlike you, I will respect her choice. Now get out of my house." Camilla slammed the door shut, leaving the box of truffles fallen on the floor. Mary picked it up and took it to the kitchen without saying anything. Edward stood there, processing. He had imagined that moment so many times during their relationship. Camilla begging to come back, he having the power to refuse. But now that it happened, he only felt nothing. Neither satisfaction nor anger, just indifference. She no longer mattered. 2 days later, it was Roderick's turn to appear. His younger brother arrived driving a new Porsche, wearing an expensive suit, smiling too broadly. He hugged Edward as if the last 6 months hadn't happened. "Bro, look at you, on your feet. I always said you were indestructible." "You didn't say anything." Edward pulled away from the hug. "You disappeared." "Oh, come on, don't be like that. I was busy, you know how it is. Business never stops. But I always thought about you. Thought about me so much you couldn't visit even once." Roderick had the decency to look embarrassed, but recovered quickly. "Look, I came here to talk about the company. I have a proposal. You're recovering, you're doing well, that's great. But you need someone to help you with the day-to-day operations. I can be that someone. We can be real partners, brothers working together. You want a share of the company, Edward translated. I want to help. And yes, I think it's fair that I'm compensated for it. We're brothers, Ed. Family. We should be in this together. Where was this family mentality when I was alone? In the hospital? When I came back to this house with no one? When I couldn't even bathe myself? Roderick opened his mouth, closed it, opened it again. I'm not good with those things, bro. Hospitals make me uncomfortable. Sickness makes me uncomfortable. But now you're fine, so we can move on. No, Roderick, you can move on. Away from me and away from my company. You're not serious. I am. And you can take Mum with you when you leave. Mum, she's here. She's waiting in the living room. You arranged to come together, didn't you? Or do you think I'm an idiot? Roderick had the decency to look ashamed this time. Edward walked past him and went to the living room, where Mrs. Gloria was sitting on the sofa, nervously fiddling with her designer handbag. Mom, my son. She stood up and tried to hug him, but Edward kept his distance. Thank God you're better. I prayed so much for you. Prayed from the Hamptons? Because that's where Roderick posted a photo with you the same week I returned from the hospital. Mrs. Gloria paled. My son, I can explain. I was very unwell, very stressed. Roderick took me to rest a bit. It would have been bad for you to see me like that. It would have been bad for me? Or would it have been bad for you? Edward sat in the armchair opposite her. You're my mother. You should have stayed. Even if it was difficult. Even if it was painful. Mothers stay. I've always been sensitive, Mrs. Gloria defended herself, and there was a note of irritation in her voice now. You know that. I can't bear to see suffering. Why are you being so hard on me? I'm my mother. Exactly, because being a mother means more than giving birth to me. It means being present. And you weren't. I came now, didn't I? And I brought Roderick. We're your family, Edward. You can't just cut us out of your life. I can and I will. You only came back because I'm getting better. Because the money source hasn't dried up. But I no longer need people who only want me when I'm useful to them. Roderick entered the room, clearly having heard part of the conversation. Ed, you're being unfair. We made mistakes, okay? We admit it. But that's what family does. Makes mistakes and fixes them. Give us a chance. Edward looked at the two of them. His mother with tear-filled eyes. Real tears this time, he realized, but born from the possibility of losing access to his fortune, not from genuine remorse. His brother trying to appear sincere, but with his gaze already calculating how much money he was losing. The person who gave me a chance was that woman in the kitchen, Edward said finally. She's the one who stayed when I was unbearable. She's the one who put up with me when I had nothing good to offer. You are my blood, but she is my family. So no, I won't give you a chance. You had 6 months of chances and chose not to use any. Now it's too late. You'll regret this, Mrs. Gloria said, standing up with offended dignity. When that woman leaves you, you'll see that real family is us. If she leaves me, I will respect it. Because unlike you, I learned that love is not possession. It's a choice. And she chooses to stay every day. You only chose to come back when it was convenient. He called Mary, who appeared drying her hands on a dish towel. Mary, please, escort these people to the door and instruct the condominium security that they are no longer welcome here. Mary nodded and waited. Mrs. Gloria picked up her handbag with a dramatic flourish and left with heavy steps. Roderick behind her, muttering something about ingratitude. At the door, Roderick turned one last time. You know she's only with you for the money, don't you? Nobody stays with a cripple for love. Mary took 2 steps towards Roderick, and there was a controlled fury in her eyes that Edward had never seen. You know nothing about love, she said softly but firmly. Because if you did, you'd know that loving is choosing to stay on the difficult days. It's cleaning vomit. It's changing sheets. It's hearing the same complaint for the 20th time and still responding with patience. Love isn't what you feel when you're comfortable. It's what you do when you're not. So don't judge me when you abandoned your own brother. Roderick didn't know what to say. He simply left. When the door closed, Edward and Mary were left alone in the silence of the living room. He looked at her, this woman who had defended him, who had chosen him, who had stayed. "Thank you," he said. "I just told the truth. You said that love is choosing to stay on the difficult days. It is." "Mary," Edward hesitated, his heart pounding. "Do you stay because it's your job or because you want to stay?" Mary held his gaze for a long moment, and then, for the first time, she admitted aloud what she had known for weeks. "I stay because I want to. Because at some point in the last few months, you stopped being just the man I cared for and became the man I cared deeply about." Edward felt his chest tighten, not from pain, but from an emotion so strong he had no name for it. "I don't deserve you," he said simply. "Perhaps you didn't before, but the man you are becoming, that's the man I choose every day." They stood there looking at each other, and something fundamental changed between them. It was no longer caregiver and patient. It was two people who had found each other at the worst possible moment and built something real on top of ruins. Edward didn't kiss her. He didn't touch her, because he knew he still had work to do. He still had to prove to himself and to her that he was worthy of that affection. But for the first time in a long time, he had real hope that he could be. 6 months had passed since Edward expelled Camilla, Roderick, and his mother from the mansion. 6 months of intensive physical therapy, of small daily victories, of long conversations with Mary about dreams and regrets. 6 months of rebuilding, inside and out. Now, on a sunny September morning, Edward was standing on the back porch, without a wheelchair, without a walker, without any support. Just his own feet, his own muscles, his own determination. He took a step, then another, then 3 more. 5 steps in total before he had to lean on the balustrade, sweating and smiling. Mary was watering the orchids and dropped the hose when she saw him. She ran to him and Edward hugged her tightly. They both laughed and cried at the same time, celebrating that small and enormous miracle. "I did it," Edward said against her hair. "I really did it. I never doubted it," Mary replied, but her voice trembled with emotion. That afternoon, Edward made a call he had been postponing. To Marcus Vance. "Edward," Marcus answered cautiously, "I thought you didn't want to speak to me anymore. I need to schedule a meeting, with you and the other directors, tomorrow if possible." "Of course. About what?" "You'll know when I get there." The next morning, Edward put on his best suit. Mary helped with his tie, but this time he managed to tie the knot himself. She adjusted his collar with a tender gesture that had become natural between them. "Are you sure about this?" she asked. Edward had told her his plans the night before. "Absolutely." The office in Canary Wharf was exactly as Edward remembered it. Same designer furniture, same city view, same smell of expensive coffee. But he was different, not just physically, walking on his own feet, though with a slight limp that might never completely disappear, but in essence. Marcus, Fabian, and Gus, the 3 directors, were sitting in the conference room when Edward entered. They stood up immediately, surprised to see him walking. "Edward, you're walking." Marcus seemed genuinely impressed. "I am." Edward sat at the head of the table, in the place that had always been his. "And that's why I'm here today." He placed a leather folder on the table and opened it, revealing documents prepared by his lawyer. "I want to sell my share of the company." Absolute silence. The 3 directors exchanged glances, confused. "You want to sell?" Marcus repeated. "But why? You've recovered. You can go back to running everything." "I can," Edward agreed, "but I don't want to." He leaned back in his chair, looking at those men he once called partners but never friends. "Do you know what I realized in the last few months? That I built this company using fear and intimidation. I mistreated employees, crushed competitors, trampled on everyone who stood in my way. And you learned from me. You tried to remove me in the same way I would remove you if I could. Without consideration, without humanity, just power. Fabian began to protest, but Edward raised his hand. Let me finish. You're not villains. You're products of the environment I created. A toxic environment where the only value was profit, where people were disposable. And I no longer want to be a part of that. I no longer want to be that man. Gus cleared his throat, still confused. So, what do you want? I want to sell my share at fair market value, 52% of the company, valued at £55 million. You have 30 days to raise the money or find investors. If you succeed, the company is yours. If you don't, I'll sell to whoever offers the price I'm asking. Marcus leaned forward. And what will you do with all that money? Edward smiled, and it was a real smile. I'm going to create a rehabilitation institute, free of charge, for people who suffered accidents like mine but don't have the resources for private treatment. I'm going to invest in accessibility in businesses and public spaces. I'm going to use the money I earned being cruel to help people who were forgotten by society, as I almost was. The three directors remained silent, processing. Finally, Marcus extended his hand. That's a good plan, Edward. A noble plan. I respect that. Edward shook his hand, and for the first time in years, the gesture seemed sincere on both sides. I also want to apologize, Marcus continued, for trying to remove you from the company that way. It was cowardly. You were vulnerable, and I took advantage. I'm sorry. I forgive you. And I apologize for all the years I was an impossible partner, for all the times I yelled at you, disrespected opinions, acted as if I owned the truth. They talked for another 2 hours, settling details, discussing deadlines, treating what would once be a war as a civilized transaction between adults. When Edward left that office, he knew he would never return, and he was at peace with that. The next step of the plan happened a week later. Edward rented an event hall at the Shard Hotel in London. He sent personal invitations to 47 people, the same 47 names on his list. 23 accepted to come. 24 declined or simply ignored, and Edward respected that choice. On the night of the event, Edward was more nervous than he had ever been. Mary, whom he had invited as his official companion, held his hand as they waited for the guests to arrive. "You don't have to do this," she said gently. "You've already apologized to each of them." "I know, but I need to do this for myself. I need to look at these people together and publicly admit what I did. Not over the phone, not in private, in front of everyone." Gradually, the guests arrived. Robert Fletcher, the construction manager. Patricia Smith, the pregnant receptionist. Amanda, the intern. Leo, the supplier. Danielle, the architect. Each of them carrying stories of how Edward had hurt them. When everyone was seated, Edward stepped onto the small stage set up in the hall. His hands trembled, but he took a deep breath and began. "Good evening, everyone. Thank you for coming. I know many of you had to swallow your pride to be here. Some of you probably hate me. I understand, and I respect that." He paused, looking at each face. "I gathered you here because I want to apologize. Again, but this time in person, looking into your eyes. Each of you has a story of how I hurt you. I abused my power. I used my position to humiliate, diminish, destroy. I was a cruel man who confused strength with cruelty and success with human worth." Some people in the audience nodded. Others kept their expressions closed. "I am not here asking for forgiveness. Forgiveness is your choice, not my right. I am here publicly acknowledging my mistakes, admitting that I was wrong, that you did not deserve the treatment you received, that each of you is worthy of respect and humanity, something I did not give." Edward saw tears in the eyes of some people. He saw anger in the eyes of others. "I suffered an accident that left me in a wheelchair, and at that moment I lost everything. My mobility, my fiancé, my family, my friends, everything. And I realized that I had built an entire life based on lies. On the lie that I was better than others. On the lie that power was the same as worth. On the lie that I didn't need anyone. He looked at Mary, who was sitting in the front row with tears streaming down her face. One woman stayed. The only person I had treated as invisible for years. And she taught me what I should have learned a long time ago. That humanity is not weakness. That asking for help is not shame. That loving is more important than winning. Edward stepped down from the stage and stood in front of everyone. So I apologize to each and every one of you, and I promise to spend the rest of my life trying to be better, trying to help instead of destroy, trying to build instead of tear down. Not because I think it erases what I did, but because it's the only way I know to give meaning to what I've learned. The silence that followed was heavy. Then, slowly, Robert stood up. He looked at Edward for a long moment before speaking. I forgive you, not because you deserve it, but because I deserve peace. One by one, others stood up. Some said they forgave, others just nodded. Some remained seated, and Edward respected that too. In the end, Amanda was the last to stand. I don't know if I completely forgive you yet, she said honestly, but I respect the courage you had to do this, to admit it publicly. That counts for something. After the speeches during the dinner Edward offered, he circulated among the tables, talking individually with each person, listening to their stories, their pains, their paths since he hurt them. He cried several times, but he wasn't ashamed of the tears. At the end of the night, when only he and Mary remained in the hall, Edward did something he had been planning for weeks. He knelt, a painful but now possible movement, and took her hand. Mary Grace, you saved me, not just physically, but in every possible way. You taught me how to be human again. You taught me that love is action, not words. You taught me that strength lies in serving, not in dominating. He took a small box from his pocket and opened it, revealing a simple gold ring with a modest diamond. Nothing like the extravagant ring he had given Camilla, but infinitely more meaningful. I don't have the right to ask this. I know you deserve much better than me, but I also know that I love you in a way I've never loved anyone. I love you for the person you are. I love you for what you taught me. I love you because you chose to stay when everyone else left. Will you marry me? Mary was openly crying now. She knelt too, coming to his height, and held Edward's face with both hands. I accept, not because you're rich or because you can walk again. I accept because I saw who you really are beneath all those layers of pain and anger. I accept because I love you too. They kissed there, kneeling on the floor of an empty hall. Two people who had found the improbable in the midst of tragedy. 2 years later, Edward was walking beside Mary in Richmond Park. He still limped a little, especially when he was tired, but he could walk for miles without help. They came to the park every Sunday morning, always bringing bread to feed the ducks. The Edward Armstrong Rehabilitation Institute was about to complete its first year of operation. They had served over 200 patients with spinal cord injuries, offering physical therapy, psychological support, and equipment free of charge. Edward spent 3 days a week there, not as president or director, but as a volunteer. He talked to patients, shared his story, offered hope. Mary had become the coordinator of the Institute's family support program, helping patients' families cope with the changes and challenges. She was loved by everyone, treating each person with the same dignity and compassion she had treated Edward. They got married, in a small ceremony at Mary's family farm chapel in the Cotswolds. Only true friends and colleagues from the Institute. Neither Roderick nor Mrs. Gloria nor Camilla were invited. Edward had made peace with the past, but that didn't mean keeping toxic people in his life. That Sunday morning, as they walked hand in hand, Edward thought about everything that had happened. The fall, literal and metaphorical, the loneliness, the pain, but also the redemption, the transformation, the love. What are you thinking about? Mary asked, noticing his silence. I'm thinking that accident was the best thing that ever happened to me. Mary stopped walking and looked at him in surprise. You're not serious. I am. Because if it weren't for that accident, I would never have stopped. Never would have looked at my life and seen the emptiness it was. Never would have learned what truly matters. And I never would have seen you. The woman who was there all along, but whom I was too blind to see. He pulled Mary into a tight embrace right there in the middle of the path, with children running around them and birds singing in the trees. You saved my life, Mary, in every possible way. We saved each other, she corrected. You showed me that it's never too late to start over, that people can truly change. You gave me hope. They continued walking, talking about plans for the Institute, about the new patient who had arrived last week and reminded Edward so much of his old self, about the trip they wanted to take to the Lake District for their vacation. Edward Sterling Armstrong was no longer the richest man in London. He was no longer feared or respected by the business community, but he was something much better. He was happy. Genuinely, profoundly happy. Because he had learned that wealth is not measured in money, but in true relationships. That real power is the ability to help others. That success is not how much you accumulate, but how much you transform. And there, walking beside the woman who loved him when he had nothing to offer, Edward finally understood the true meaning of being alive. It wasn't about never falling. It was about choosing to get up. It was about choosing to change. It was about choosing to love. And he had chosen well. Edward and Mary's journey shows us that even in the darkest moments, there is light. That transformation is possible when we open our hearts to change. If this story touched you, if it made you reflect on your own choices and relationships, leave a like and subscribe to the channel for more stories that move and inspire. Tell us in the comments, do you believe people can truly change? What moment in the story affected you the most? Your opinion is important to us. And remember, it's never too late to start over, to ask for forgiveness, to be better. See you in the next story.